All right. So I'm getting better at this. Today's video is the shortest one that I've done yet by a few minutes. And that was kind of intentional because this is a topic and a people that we're being introduced to today that I want to be able to unpack a little bit more thoroughly and to take some time to slow down instead of talking about bigger swaths of time, to be able to just talk about a couple of years at a time. So here we go. Oh, hey, friend. Welcome back. This is the Space Between YouTube series in which we are exploring the space between the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. In which we are buffering. Exploring the space between the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. Uh-oh. Oh, hey, friend. Welcome back. This is the Space Between YouTube series in which we are exploring the space between the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. Last week, you may remember, we were delving into this brief but energetic period of Jewish history in which they were actually a free and independent nation, and they were ruled by what we call the Hasmonean dynasty. Last week we talked about this power couple of Alexander Jannaeus, who was a kind of a power-hungry, bloodthirsty king who did all kinds of things that maybe he shouldn't have done and oversaw this bloody civil war between the Sadducees and Pharisees. This is the guy who crucified 800 Pharisees and had killed their families in front of them and then had some banquet with his concubines and laughed while it was happening. Like that guy. And then his wife, Salome Alexandra, who was the exact opposite, who was of the opposing political party too, and she was a great negotiator and diplomat, and she started to make peace between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. She put the Pharisees in positions of power. She built fortified cities for the Sadducees so that they could have some sense of peace, and it looked like maybe she was going to be able to bring about a period of peace and prosperity. But I teased you at the end there that these sorts of things don't always last. And she had two sons. One of them was a mild-mannered, peace-loving Pharisee named Hyrcanus II. The other one was a more brash and commanding and popular Sadducee named Aristobulus II. And when she died, she put Hyrcanus, she set it up so that he would become the ruler after she died. He had already been the high priest for a long period of time. And he lasted as the ruler of Judea for 3 months. Yeah, it only took 3 months for his brother Aristobulus to make a run for the throne, and him being the more skilled one in war, and, he's a Sadducee, and they just so happen to have all of these fortified cities they can use. He won handily. In fact, a lot of Hyrcanus's army deserted him and went over to his brother's side. So, after a short war between the two of them, peace was attained. And Aristobulus got the title of ruler, and he also got the title of high priest, and Hyrcanus was allowed to live. That seemed pretty good, right? And he was also given a stipend for the rest of his life. He would be taken care of so that he didn't have to worry so much, because he was, after all, the ruler's brother and the former high priest. This kind of seemed like it might be a fairly good situation now, where the brothers were at peace and maybe there wouldn't be so much war. But then a certain Antipater, that's the guy's name, Antipater, well, he started whispering in Hyrcanus's ear. He started saying, your brother, Aristobulus, he acts like he wants peace, but he doesn't really. He's actually plotting to kill you because he's afraid of you. He's afraid of your strength and your power because he knows that you are the rightful heir of the kingdom. And so he's going to try to kill you, and so you must flee. Come with me, and we will flee together, and then we will mount a rebellion against your brother, and then we will retake the throne that is rightfully yours. And this guy, Antipater, was so convincing, and he was so politically savvy that it worked. And something else that I should mention is that he was the governor of Idumea. Now, if Idumea sounds familiar, it's because we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. Um, Maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago at this point, when Hyrcanus II's grandfather, John Hyrcanus, became the ruler of Judea. He was the first one to rule over the free peoples of Judea without any outside influence. And he took the opportunity to conquer all of the surrounding tribes around him. Do you remember this guy? And he's the one that burned down the temple in Samaria. He's also the one that forced people to convert to Judaism. He had them circumcised, and they had to follow all of the laws and the sacrifices and all of that if they wanted to remain in the land. And so Idumea was one of those places. It was just south of Jerusalem. And the inhabitants of Idumea came under the jurisdiction of Judea. And by circumcision and by birth, they were technically Jews, though not by lineage. They had no direct lineage to Abraham and all of that. And so they were kind of like, if Judea was the children of Israel, they were like the stepchildren of Israel. It's kind of this very weird position where they're both Jews but not Jews, and they're in but they're not in. They're circumcised, but it doesn't really matter. So this guy, Antipater, he was one of them, and he was the governor of Idumea. And so they ran off to Idumea together, and they staged this coup, and it was so successful that nobody was winning, and both sides, plus a third side that just wanted to do away with the kingship altogether, petitioned to Rome to please just come in here and help us. Just decide. Just help us figure out who should be the rightful independent king of Judea. And man, did they ever come in and sort things out? It reminds me, when I was a kid and my mom would tell me to clean my room and then I wouldn't, and she'd say, clean your room, and then I wouldn't, and she'd say, clean your room, and then I wouldn't, and then she'd say, if you don't clean your room, I'm going to clean your room, and if I clean your room, you won't like it because I'm coming in with a trash bag. And that's kind of like what Rome did. They came in with a trash bag, and they just said, you know what, you all can't handle independence, and now it's ours. See, when they first made these treaties with Rome, during the Maccabean period, earlier on, like 100 years ago, Rome was still a good, thriving republic. Rome had been a republic for 500 years, a government of the people, by the people, mostly concerned with what was happening over there in modern-day Italy. But the rise of these powerful generals during this time period, plus a lot of corruption among the wealthy elites in Rome itself, and the whole Mediterranean saw them teetering towards authoritarianism. And this one general named Pompey, well, he had designs for global dictatorship. And he's the one who steps in Judea and says, you know what? None of this. I'm in charge now. And the next 30 years, which are going to pass by very quickly, are going to see this hectic power grab in Rome between these generals, the likes of which you may have heard, like Pompey and Julius Caesar and Crassus and Augustus and Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and they'll all be vying for control, all in the name of preserving the Republic, but none of them actually plan to preserve the Republic. They all just want to be dictators, which is pretty clear from how they handled it when they won. But Judea is going to be right in the middle of all of this. It's in a really great location in between Egypt and Asia. It's It's this great port on the Mediterranean. It's a great staging ground for military. It's just a really good location. And so we're going to see Judea actually become an important people group during this time. And what the leaders are going to start doing here is they're going to start picking generals that they like, that they think will win, and that offer them good terms, and they're going to support them. But then when it seems like the tide is shifting, they're going to switch allegiances really quickly to the other side and support them and hope that they support them back. And this is what happens right here. Because at first, when Pompey came in, he installed Hyrcanus II back in the role as high priest. So he gets to be high priest again. He doesn't really even want to be ruler, so he doesn't mind that. And they install our good friend Antipater as the governor of Judea, because he was already the governor of Idumea, and he's doing such a great job. We might as well just give him a little bit more territory. So now we have this Idumean who is in charge of Judea, and Hyrcanus gets to be high priest again. But then Pompey and Julius Caesar start to go at it, and Pompey gets killed in Egypt, and Julius Caesar looks like he's going to be the one who pulls ahead, but he's having a hard military time down in Egypt. So Antipater sends 3,000 Jewish troops down to Egypt to help Julius Caesar and also to try to win his favor, because it seems like Julius Caesar is going to be the guy who's going to be in charge, and we want to get out ahead of this and pick the winner of this fight. And so for his kindness, Caesar gave Judea special treatment. Eliminated some of the taxes. The people were protected by Roman legions, and he gave Antipater Roman citizenship, which is a huge deal. Even like common people in Rome didn't have Roman citizenship. That came with certain perks. And it was also a way that the Romans got leaders to side with them over their own people. So they give this citizenship to the leaders and to the very influential, important people of the conquered lands, so that they'll side with the Romans over their own people. So what kinds of things did this mean for Antipater? What kinds of goodies did he get? Well, first of all, he got the right to a fair trial and legal protection. So he could sue other people, but he was protected legally speaking. If there was a court that tried him in a way he didn't like, he could appeal it to a higher court, all the way up to Caesar himself. He could not be tortured or executed, which is kind of a big deal, seeing how all of these people were tortured and executed in those days. You can't be crucified if you're a Roman citizen, so that's nice too. You could own property anywhere in the world. You didn't have to pay taxes, and you had a lifetime supply of grain delivered to you as a form of universal basic income of Roman citizens. It's a pretty sweet gig. And Roman citizenship, once it's granted to you, then gets passed down to your sons as well. And this would become very important for his 25-year-old son, whom he just made the governor of Galilee, a young man you may know, goes by the name of Herod. He's not Herod the Great quite yet, just Herod the 20-something. And we're going to talk a lot more in depth about Herod next week. Trust me, he's kind of an important character in the New Testament. But let's just take a second here and appreciate what just happened in this short span of like 10 years. There was Jewish independence at the beginning of this lesson. But it was really short-lived, only about 100 years, because it decayed from within. In this fighting between Pharisees and Sadducees, between the Greeks and the Jews, between the traditionalists and the contemporary people. And then the Roman Republic, which was at one point a republic, a government of the people, started to become a totalitarian empire and assisted the brothers who were fighting by simply taking over. And the Romans then appoint a politically savvy Idumean by the name of Antipater, who is only in the picture because of his grandfather's forced conversion, which I told you was going to be a bad idea, John Hyrcanus. Didn't listen to me. And just like that, they are ruled by an occupying empire and a puppet governor who's not even really Jewish. And all of this 100 years after we have Judas Maccabee and his brothers who zealously saved them from foreign tyranny and restored proper worship of Yahweh to the temple. But boy, howdy, does power have a way of corrupting even the best intentions, doesn't it? I mean, this is a story as old as time, but it's one that is very clearly played out in this brief period of independence. Also, a really good example of what happens when you try to mix religious power and political power. They often end up corrupting each other. And also what happens when the religious leaders are not actually following the convictions that they're teaching others to follow. But that's a lesson for us to learn today, I think. Maybe we can stop this cycle from happening. But hey, join us next week. We're going to go much more in depth into Antipater's son, Herod the Great, who, depending on who you ask, is either a sociopathic monster who has all of the babies under 2 in Bethlehem murdered, or the greatest king in Jewish history who brought about unparalleled wealth, riches, independence, and worship of the true God, depending on who you read and what you believe. So we're going to untangle some of the myth, the history, the legend, the propaganda around perhaps the most infamous leader of Judea, Herod the Great. I'll see you next week. All right. So, are there any, what are your clarifying questions? Any lingering unclearness?
The
That's not a
one that
word.
jumps out to me has to do with Roman citizenship, which you describe in great detail. How is it that Paul had achieved Roman citizenship?
So we know that Paul comes from Tarsus, and Tarsus, I believe, was a city that was created for like a retirement community for Roman soldiers. Um, I could be getting that mixed up, but that is what I think. And he says in Acts 22 that his father was granted citizenship. And so he was born into it, because like I said, the children receive the citizenship of their father, and well, the sons anyway. So we're not sure exactly how his father got it, whether that was through military service or whether he purchased it. At that point of Paul, and with Paul we're talking let's see, 80 years after what's happening here right now. The empire was firmly an empire, and they were looking for ways to make money. So they were then selling citizenship as well. So we also in Acts 22, the guard that is about to whip Paul says, "How did you get your citizenship? Mine was very expensive." So, and Paul says, I was born into it. I'm old money." He also had a great education, studying in the best schools. So we know Paul came from money one way or another.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Was Paul a Pharisee?
Yeah,
Okay.
Paul describes himself as the Pharisee of Pharisees, that he was.
So would that mean his father was a Pharisee, probably?
That's what he says. He says he comes from a long line of Pharisees.
Okay.
He's basically a Kennedy. So he's got money. He went to the Ivy League schools. He's smart and charismatic, and has the world handed to him on a silver platter until Jesus messes it up. But at this point, Roman citizenship was really just a perk of the wealthy and well-connected in Rome. And then they
And,
started offering it to other leaders. So
and
like,
that and those other leaders could be far away in other countries.
yeah, so if Antipater becomes a Roman citizen, even though he lives in Judea and Idumea, that means that he has all of these perks. As long as the Romans are in control, he has all of these perks. So now he has an incentive to keep Romans in power. Because if the Romans then leave Judea, they get kicked out or whatever.
Because that's a good distance from like Rome to. So they found out, I guess, by traveling the armies or whatever, that this information would be brought to them, to the other countries from Rome.
Mhm.
They because there's no roads to drive over like there are now. So how in the world took a long time then for them to get all that information?
I don't know. I mean, we pave our roads here, and then 5 years they're full of potholes. But there are still Roman roads that are still in good shape. They were very good road builders. We actually have a lot of the communication in the ancient world, um, like how good it was. We can thank Alexander the Great and his conquest, because then they started setting
Okay,
up these trade routes and
okay,
shipping lanes, and it got a lot easier. I mean, it would still take weeks, but
right,
it wasn't like sailing over the Atlantic.
okay,
So like Pompey gave him citizenship, and then would have then sent a messenger to Rome to ratify it and put it in writing somewhere so that it would be, if the time would come where he would have to appeal to a higher court, then he would be able to. And actually, that does happen. And I don't want to spoil it for next week, but Herod ends up in a tricky situation where he is supposed to be the next ruler, but they depose him before he can, and he appeals it to
okay,
the higher court because he's a Roman citizen, and then they intervene and install him as the king of the Jews. So it's this Roman citizenship that's given to his dad that is the reason why Herod becomes king.
okay.
It was actually one of the questions that I was thinking about during this, was how fast news would have traveled. As I wasn't even thinking about across the Mediterranean, but just in terms of, so if
Their trade
Hyrcanus
route
this,
the
so
trade
like,
route, it would be quite a long distance, really.
yeah, so say Hyrcanus II was the high priest in Jerusalem, and he lasts for 3 months before his brother
Takes over.
takes the city and conquers it and takes over the high priesthood. How long do you think it would take someone in Galilee to know that that happened?
I don't know the mileage between cities there. That would be interesting to figure out.
Yeah, and like, who would even think? Like, well, now we have to go and tell every corner of Israel that we now have a new high priest. Like, I'm wondering, because we don't know, but it feels like it would take a long time. Like, you might not know that there's a new high priest until you have to travel to Jerusalem for Passover, and you look up and you go, wait a second, that's a new guy.
Yeah, not the same person.
Yeah. And we always talk about history in terms of the big names and the rich people and the leaders, because that's who wrote the histories. But it makes me wonder how life was like for just the everyday fisherman. Like, how
Right.
much changed during all this turnover?
Yeah, how does it affect their everyday life to have all these people fighting over who's in charge and stuff like that? Um,
Yeah. And if they're that far disconnected from the center of power, like if you're living in Jerusalem, okay, you probably can tell a lot of this and it affects you. But if you're living out in the country somewhere,
yeah,
what was
no,
life like, I wonder?
good question. And I keep thinking of it in like modern day here, things travel so fast. And even though we're not right in the city, we have our own area. Um,
Hmm.
where did they do their shopping and getting information from? Um, they didn't have news reporters like we do, and papers.
No, it would probably be with, some caravan of merchants are traveling around, and when they come into town, they bring their wares, and then they also bring some news that they heard, and rumors
Yeah,
spread, right? And then they change. And
but do those caravan, if you're not on the trade route, would they go to the smaller towns?
hmm,
Hmm.
yeah, like how there were 100 years later still people living in places who don't know the Civil War's over, right?
Probably, yeah. Or there was even a war. They
Oh,
might.
in the War of 1812, there was a huge decisive battle in New Orleans that took place a month after the war had ended, because
Oh,
news hadn't reached them yet, and Andrew Jackson was the general there, and
yeah, there's
thousands of people died, and it's this big victory, but it didn't matter because the war was over anyway. So even if they would have lost, they still would have won the war.
that's weird.
Yeah, that's honestly kind of how I think about history, like our current world, where I believe that Christ has already redeemed all of creation, but we're just not there yet. And so the war is over, but we still are fighting these little battles because as right.
Okay, yeah,
But
I can see that.
they don't actually affect the outcome of the war itself, because evil has already been triumphed over.
Well, it has.
Yeah.
We just haven't figured that out yet, I guess.
I think that was one of my Christmas Eve sermons at one point. But I think it probably word would have spread the fastest when independence was first achieved. Like when the Maccabean revolt from a couple of weeks ago, when they first achieved national independence and they kicked the Seleucids out and they had their own ruler on the throne. That I feel like would have been announced far and wide. Like they would have sent criers out to the towns to announce to everyone that you are now free. And there is now a high priest in Jerusalem, and a king again, and we are a people again. And this is the answer to all of our prayers and our prophecies.
Yeah, that seems logical because everybody would want to celebrate then.
Yeah. Well, and they had to. That was one of the declarations, was that they were to celebrate the rededication of the temple every year, which is Hanukkah. That's coming up.
Okay.
They still do it. But then it didn't last. It really felt like, I think it probably really felt like this was the answer to all of those prophecies, like in Isaiah and Jeremiah, that talked about the line of David being restored, right? The the shoot that comes from the stump of Jesse's tree, and
Right.
that this child would be born, and that we'd have this new age come, this new messianic age of freedom and prosperity. A lot of people heralded that as that time, and it only lasted like 100 years at best
Wow.
before, like, this bloody history between the Pharisees and Sadducees, brothers fighting over the throne, like a king who also wants to be a high priest, and like the sullying of the temple in that way and the office of high priest, and everything just kind of coming home to roost and realizing that this is not what we had expected or what we had been promised. And that level of like,
They were looking for something better or more important, I guess, to happen. And
yeah,
they got dissatisfied. They weren't content.
yeah. Well, it's almost like they wanted a king and a conqueror and a like a worldly conqueror
Right,
and king, and they got one. And then it was awful because it was a worldly conqueror and king, and all of the power dynamics that come with that.
right.
And so this period of time, this is like 60 years before Jesus was born. And this level of unfulfilled expectations for the Messiah, that it really wasn't Judas Maccabees, and that this kind of earthly systems are just not built for long-term success. That messianic fervor really starts to bubble up at this point. And now people aren't necessarily just looking for a king or conqueror, but they're looking for something a bit more divine. So you can start to see where Jesus starts to fit into this. Where the people who are following Jesus, who see him as the savior, like, what would it have been, 80 years after this, they're dissatisfied with political saviors and with military saviors, and
Okay.
because it
Because
didn't
you're never
last.
yeah, that doesn't always last. It's because somebody always wants that power. You might
Hmm.
have it right now, but somebody else wants it. So that's why they're never satisfied.
Yeah. And it's not even, it's bad enough that it was taken from them by the Romans, but then they got their king taken away from them, and then now they have to be ruled over by Edomites, the Idumeans. Like, oh, what an insult to them.
So they're not even the Jewish people. So that probably kind of made them upset then too.
Yeah, that's probably why Herod gets such wildly divergent descriptions of who he was and what he did. Some people seem to really love him, and some people hate him because he's the wrong guy. He's the wrong kind of person. He's not Jewish. He's not one of us. Also, he was probably a sociopath and he murdered a lot of people, so he wasn't a great person. um, yeah, but I think this period, when Jewish independence ends, really ushers in the next level of the messianic expectation. Like, this, almost more than anything, sets the stage for John the Baptist and Jesus. And you see some of the people who follow Jesus still expecting him to fit that old mold of conqueror and king.
Right.
And he's very adamant that that didn't work. And it's not going to work this time. I'm calling you to something higher,
Right.
to
Right.
something more universal that doesn't care about, lines of
Power and wealth and all
succession. Yeah. Yeah. Because someone's always going to try to take it from you. There's going to be another Rome,
that.
right? I mean, they had Assyria, and then Babylon, and then Persia, and then Macedonia, and then Ptolemies, and the Seleucids, and then a brief time of independence, and then the Romans. So, who's to say that there's not going to be another empire after the Romans?
There's always someone out there looking to get ahead and take everything.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's just material stuff,
Mm.
basically. Um, and that's not what Jesus is telling us. It's more spiritual stuff.
Yeah.
We're, um, it's how you think and feel and, I guess, get along with each other. It's not what you have and who's bigger and who's more powerful. Because there's always going to be somebody out there to try and take it from you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is why America can't save you, and money can't save you, and
Right,
capitalism can't save you. You know,
right.
the United States wasn't always in charge of the world, and we won't be forever. And there'll be another empire that will.
Well, there'll never be an empire that's in charge of the whole world because somebody's always going to be out there that's going to want to take it from you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've done our darndest to try to be in charge of the whole world for the past
Doesn't
since
work.
World War II, at least economically, and now we're seeing that start to teeter towards China. And you know, if they take over the global leadership role in that terms, who knows who's next? It could be anyone, because it's always happened and it always will happen. And
Right.
so if you're putting your hope in chariots and horses, as they say in Psalms, then you're going to be disappointed.
Somebody's
But
going
you're,
to take them away from you.
yeah. So the hope in Christ is one step above that. It's a way of navigating through the world instead
It's
of.
trying to get along with everybody because we're all here together. Is something, wait a minute. Oh, somewhere my cousin sends me this stuff on the internet and something about 100% of the deaths all happen on Earth. In other words, 100% of all deaths in the universe happen on Earth.
You say all deaths happen on Earth?
I'm trying to remember how it went.
So far, that's true. Aside from a couple of dogs and monkeys that the Soviets sent up.
Well, yes, but they
Right?
still came from here. They didn't come from someplace else.
No, you're right. They started here.
They originated here.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah.
Yeah. There's something called the overview effect that astronauts always talk about. That the first time they go up in space and they leave the atmosphere and they get that time of peace once the rockets are done firing,
Okay, and
and
it's silence.
they look down and they see the Earth from the outside of it, and they see how fragile it is
Small.
and small, and they don't see lines and borders, and they just see the planet. There is something that changes in a person. They've all expressed this, that suddenly you take on this global consciousness, and
Right.
the idea of nationalities just evaporates.
Well,
And
nationalities make discrimination
yeah,
because you claim to be an American, a Russian, a Chinese, and you discriminate against anybody else that's around. So but we're all a human being. We all have the same DNA, basically, right?
yeah,
Pretty much makes us a human. But then there's tweaks in there that make us have our personalities.
yeah.
So that's where I think we forget that we are all connected that way. And that's kind of why there's always these battles and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good word. It's, the birth of the environmental movement was when, in the 70s, when we had sent the Voyager spacecraft out to look at the outer planets, and they convinced the NASA to turn it around and to take a picture of Earth from the perspective of Jupiter. And all it was a pale blue dot right? Suspended in a sunbeam. And that picture, when people saw for the first time how small
We
Earth
really
was,
are.
then that spawned the entire environmental movement, because we realized that we're a global species and we're so small
Right.
and we're so similar. Yeah.
But yeah, we have more similarities than we have uh, differences, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the, actually in our text from this week or last week, one of those two, where Paul was defending himself. No, it's this week. He says, he's explaining himself, and he gets to the point where he says that, and God called me to then leave here and bring the good news out to the Gentiles and the greater Greek world. And the people went ballistic on him because, he's expanding. He's making grace bigger. He's thinking of a global consciousness instead of a local consciousness. He's
Right.
thinking about in terms of a human race instead of a small chosen people. And that expansion of grace that Jesus brings was just too much for people who had, honestly, who had been through this history of being an oppressed people and then like briefly getting freedom, but then being oppressed again. So the thought
Okay.
of like, why would you bring
The
good
rest
news
of
to
them.
someone else when we're suffering here? Like, take care of our own people first before you start talking about people out in the Mediterranean. And
But
Paul
they don't
says,
realize that those people are the same as we are.
right. And Paul says, you're thinking too small. You're thinking way too small. You don't
If we
own
could,
God.
right.
Hmm.
If we could open our minds and kind of accept that, it'd make it a lot easier.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this Sunday we will talk. That's kind of where I was feeling led to share in my sermon on Sunday. This um, expanding of grace and the uh, how Paul uses his Roman citizenship not for his own selfish gain, but as a tool to be able to spread that grace further
To
and
get
further. And so I'll talk more on Sunday about.
Your sermons have been very good the last couple of weeks.
Oh,
They
well, thank
open
you.
up
It's been.
a lot of thoughts and things that go through, like the picking out of the 10 things that you told us to do.
Did you do it?
I did some of them.
I really want to read some of these from people.
But yeah, and the one time you told us, like, I think it was, I don't remember, I wrote it down somewhere. Oh, the 10 ways or something we were supposed to think of. Brain's not functioning.
That's fine.
But yeah, some of those, if people would kind of just sit there, that's, I think, our main problem as human beings. We are so busy doing stuff in the world and trying to do this and do that and go here and do that and be this and get that. We don't really look inside ourselves much.
Mm.
And I think we're afraid to.
You might be onto something there. Yeah. A friend of mine told me recently that we're human beings, not human doings.
That's a good one. But yeah, we don't take the time to hash out and think about what we do and say or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for once again writing my sermon. And I look forward to seeing you on Sunday.
Yeah, I will try and be here as far as I know.
Okay. Wonderful.
So
Wonderful.